In the third week of January 1867, snow fell so heavy above the grade near Cisco that the Central Pacific's tunnel crews stopped counting it in inches and started counting it in feet. In the company's own ledger, the young woman cooking and boiling wash water for that crew was never once written down by name, only as cook, female, Chinese, and a contract number inherited from a father who had died crossing the Pacific to reach her. In that camp, the mountain gave the orders, and the labor contractor decided who ate and how much. Every man packed into those snow sheds expected to bury half the crew before the thaw, and the cook first. But what the foreman did for her that first night of the freeze, and what she carried folded inside her father's herbalist trunk, meant that when the rescue shovels finally broke through in April, the company counted every single man alive. The avalanche came down off the ridge above the tunnel mouth without warning, in the dead hours before dawn, burying the timber snow sheds under a wall of packed snow 20 feet high and sealing the bore where the company's tunnel gang had been cutting granite for the better part of 2 years. Camp 11, 40 men and 1 woman, was cut off from the railhead, from the company doctor, from the wagon road, from everything but what was already inside the sheds when the mountain let go. Word came slow, relayed man to man in the dark, that the tunnel's far entrance and the doctor who slept near it was buried just as deep as the near one. Whatever this camp needed to survive the weeks before a rescue crew could dig them out, it already had inside its walls, or it did not have at all. The labor contractor, a company man named Pruitt, took stock of the stores that first gray morning with a lamp in one hand and a ledger in the other, and announced the ration before he announced anything else. Half portions of rice and salt pork, doled out by his own hand, at his own hour, because a man who controlled the food controlled the camp, avalanche or no avalanche. When one of the older hands suggested the herbalist's daughter might have something in her father's trunk worth trying against the scurvy that always came with weeks of salt meat and no green food, Pruitt only laughed, low and short, and said the men would keep their strength better on prayer than on a dead man's roots. Nobody in that shed argued with him, not yet. That first night of the seal, while Pruitt counted his sacks of rice by lamplight, the foreman, a hard, grief-worn Irishman named Callahan, who had buried his own brother in a blast on this same grade 3 winters before, walked back to where the woman sat alone by the cook fire and asked her, plainly, what her name actually was, not the number in Pruitt's ledger, not cook, female, Chinese, but the name her father had given her. Then he handed her the key to the boxcar where the company kept what medicine it had. What she did with that key, with her father's trunk of dried roots and pine needles and bark, and with an abacus she used to outcount a contractor who thought numbers were his alone to control, is the story of how a snowbound camp of 40 desperate men learned her name before the spring ever came. The ship that carried them out of Canton Harbor took 41 days to reach San Francisco, and her father did not live to see 30 of them. He had packed his herbalist trunk with more care than he packed anything else they owned. Dried willow bark wrapped in oiled paper, pine needles bundled and hung to keep their color, roots sorted by season and use in compartments he had built with his own hands, and somewhere past the midpoint of the crossing, in a hold thick with the smell of bilge water and sickness, the fever that had already taken 2 other passengers took him too, quickly, before Mei Yin could brew him even the tea he had spent a lifetime teaching other people to trust. She sat with the trunk between her knees for the rest of the voyage, one hand always resting on its lid, because it was the only inheritance left to her that a labor broker in San Francisco could not simply write into a different column of his ledger. When the broker met the ship at the dock and read down his list of contracted debts, hers was the shortest entry on the page, her father's name crossed through, and beneath it, in the same ink, her own debt now, inherited whether she had agreed to it or not. At the labor office near the wharf, a clerk in a green eyeshade copied her father's contract into a fresh page without once asking how to spell her name, because he had not asked what her name was in the first place. He wrote in a hand made quick by long practice, cook, female, Chinese, and beside it the same 6-digit contract number that had followed her father since Canton, now hers by inheritance, and by the simple fact that a debt, unlike a person, did not die when the body carrying it did. A foreman from the Central Pacific's grade contractor bought the paper that same afternoon, along with 11 other contracts belonging to men she did not know, and Mei Yin was loaded onto a freight car bound for the Sierra foothills, among sacks of rice and coils of fuse wire, cargo of a different kind, traveling under the same manifest. She watched the flat delta country give way to foothills through a gap in the boxcar slats, holding her father's trunk against her chest, and thought that somewhere between Canton and this rattling car, she had stopped being a daughter and started being a line item, and that no one on this side of the ocean seemed to find that strange at all. The freight wagon that carried the last leg of the journey climbed switchback roads cut into granite, past hillsides already scarred white with the season's first serious snow, and Mei Yin watched the trees change from oak to pine to something starker and taller that held snow on its branches like a held breath. Camp 11 announced itself before she saw it, the ring of hammers on iron, the smell of blasting powder and wood smoke, and then, rounding a shoulder of rock, the timber snow sheds themselves, long, low tunnels of raw lumber built over the grade to hold back exactly the kind of avalanche the drivers muttered about under their breath as they urged the mules on. Beyond the sheds, the black mouth of the company's tunnel bore into the mountain itself, ringed with scaffolding and coils of rope, men moving in and out of it like ants working a wound in the rock. A gang of Chinese laborers straightened from their shovels to watch the wagon pass, expressions unreadable in the cold, and Mei Yin understood, watching them watch her, that whatever she had imagined this contract would look like, it had not looked like this. A camp built entirely inside the mountain's shadow, waiting, all of it, for the snow that had not yet finished falling. Pruitt, the company's labor contractor, met the wagon with a ledger under his arm and looked her over the way he might look over a mule bought sight unseen, asking the driver only whether she could cook for 40 men and whether she understood plain instructions, questions he did not think to direct at her directly even once. He showed her the cook fire pit, the store's tent, the trough where the wash water was boiled, and told her the hours she would keep in a voice pitched for a man half-deaf, though her English, however imperfect, was better than his patience gave her credit for. The men on shift that first evening ate without looking at her, passing bowls hand to hand, some murmuring to each other in dialects she only partly followed, appraising the new cook the way men appraise any tool that has just been added to a crew, useful, replaceable, unremarkable. Only one man, older, weathered, a laborer named Tam, who had worked this grade 3 winters running, studied her a beat longer than the rest, taking in the careful way she balanced the ladle and the trunk she had set, deliberately, just inside the reach of her own hand, as though he already suspected there was more in that box than clothes. That first night, alone in the lean-to shed she had been given behind the cook fire, Mei Yin opened her father's trunk by the light of a single candle stub and took inventory the way he had taught her, item by item, naming each packet under her breath in the dialect he had used to teach her its properties. Willow bark, for fever and pain, dried pine needle, bitter and resinous, good against the wasting sickness that came from too many weeks without green food, ginger root, chrysanthemum, a paper twist of moxa punk for burning against cold-numbed skin. She had watched him treat half a village with what fit in a box this size, had ground his powders and rolled his moxa cones since she was old enough to hold a mortar steady, and yet here, in a camp that had written her down as cook and nothing else, none of it counted for anything unless someone thought to ask. She closed the lid carefully, the way he always had, and lay down on the thin cot listening to wind test the seams of the shed roof, and told herself that a trunk full of knowledge was not the same as a trunk full of use. Not yet. Not until this camp had a reason to need it. Pruitt ran Camp 11 the way he ran every camp the company gave him, by controlling exactly two things absolutely, the ledger of debts owed and the store's tent where the food was kept, and he made certain every man understood, within his first week, that both were his alone to open or close. He weighed out rations with a scale he trusted more than his own eyes, docked pay for broken tools without appeal, and kept a running tally of every sack of rice and side of salt pork against the day the company auditor would come through and expect the numbers to match. Mei Yin cooked what he gave her to cook, and said little, because she had already learned, in a week, that questioning the ration in front of the men only made Pruitt tighten it further to prove a point. She noticed, though, the way he never once used a man's name either, calling the crew by number or nationality the same way the labor office clerk had, and she began to understand that the ledger entry that had erased her name had erased 40 other names besides, and that Pruitt found the whole arrangement not just efficient, but correct. The men spoke around her more than to her in those first weeks, discussing wages and homesickness and the dangers of the tunnel face in her hearing, as though she were part of the furniture of the cook fire, rather than a woman standing 3 feet away with 2 working ears. One evening, a younger hand, newly arrived from a different grade camp, asked the others in slow, careless English whether the cook understood a word anyone said, and Tam, without looking up from his bowl, answered that it hardly mattered, since nobody bothered asking her opinion on anything regardless. Mei Yin kept ladling and said nothing, filing the exchange away the way she had learned to file everything since the dock at San Francisco, because a woman who let every slight land immediately would have nothing left of herself by winter's end. She understood more English than any of them assumed, had understood the broker, the clerk, Pruitt's flat instructions, all of it, and she was beginning to understand something else too, that being underestimated, in a camp this isolated, might one day be the only advantage a woman in her position was ever going to get. By the second week of January, the snow had stopped behaving like weather and started behaving like a season unto itself, falling in walls thick enough to blot out the ridge above the tunnel mouth for days at a stretch, and the older hands, the ones who had wintered on this grade before, grew quieter than the newer men, watching the shed's roof beams the way sailors watch a sky they do not trust. Tam told her, in the brief exchanges they had taken to having over the cook fire once the others had gone to their bunks, that a bad winter up here did not announce itself with thunder, only with silence, a held breath in the mountain just before it let go. He told her about a slide 2 seasons back on a different stretch of grade that had buried 6 men before anyone heard it coming, and Mei Yin, listening, thought of her father's trunk and wondered, not for the first time, whether the knowledge folded inside it was meant for exactly this kind of waiting, or whether it would sit unopened and unused the whole winter through. One more thing this camp had decided it did not need from her. The foreman, Callahan, ran the tunnel gang the way Pruitt ran the ledger, but where Pruitt counted men as numbers, Callahan counted them as men, walking the bore each morning to check every face against his memory of who should be there, cursing when a shift ran short and going quiet, visibly when a blast went wrong. He was an Irishman gone gray too early, with a scar along one forearm from a rockfall and a habit of standing a little apart from the other white foremen at supper, as though something in him had never quite rejoined the easy company of men who had not buried a brother on this exact grade. Mei Yin had heard the story in pieces from Tam, a premature charge, 3 winters back, on a cut not 2 miles from where the tunnel now stood, and a younger Callahan pulled from the rubble too late to matter. She did not yet know why he watched the mountain the way he did, with something closer to old grief than professional caution, only that he was the one man in camp who addressed the Chinese crew by their actual names when he could manage them, and apologized, plainly, on the times he could not. The storm that would seal Camp 11 began the way the worst ones always did, according to Tam, with an afternoon so still the smoke from the cook fire rose in a straight column instead of scattering, and a sky gone the flat white-gray of a held breath. By dusk the wind had found its voice, and by full dark the snow was falling sideways hard enough that a man crossing from the tunnel mouth to the sheds needed a rope strung hand to hand to keep from losing the path entirely. Pruitt ordered the store's tent reinforced and the ration count moved up a day, muttering about supply wagons that would not make the grade again until the weather broke, and Callahan walked the length of the sheds twice that evening, checking every beam and brace with a lantern held close, saying little, his jaw set in a way Mei Yin recognized now as his particular kind of fear. She banked the cookfire carefully and packed her father's trunk into the driest corner of her lean-to, some instinct older than reason telling her that whatever the mountain was gathering itself to do, it would not wait politely for the storm to finish deciding. It came down in the dead hours before dawn, without the groan Tam had promised or any warning at all beyond a sound like a distant train that grew, in seconds, into something that shook the ground under the sheds and filled the air with a pressure Mei Yin felt in her teeth before she understood what it was. She woke already moving, one arm around her father's trunk, as the lean-to's timbers shuddered and held, and outside men were shouting in 3 languages at once, a confusion of lanterns swinging wild against a wall of white that had not been there an hour before. When the roar finally settled into an ordinary, terrible silence, the tunnel mouth that had stood open every day since she arrived was simply gone, buried under a slope of packed snow and shattered pine that rose higher than the shed roofs themselves. Callahan was among the first out into the dark, counting heads by lantern light, calling names, actual names, into the cold until he had accounted for every man and one woman sheltering in Camp 11, and only then did anyone think to ask the question that would define the weeks ahead. How far did the slide reach, and what, exactly, had it sealed them away from? By first light, the scale of it was plain enough that no one needed Callahan to explain it twice. The slide had come down squarely across the western approach, burying the tunnel's near mouth under 20 feet of packed snow and timber, and worse, according to the riders who tried and failed to force a path out along the grade, a second slide had let go somewhere along the route toward the railhead, closing the only trail a wagon or a rescue party could use to reach them before the pass itself opened again in spring. The company doctor, who kept his rounds between 3 camps along this stretch of grade, had been due at Camp 11 that very week. Instead, word came slow and second-hand that he was almost certainly trapped on the far side of the second slide, unreachable, useless to them for as long as the snow held. 40 men and 1 woman, cut off from supply, from rescue, from medicine of any kind the company recognized as medicine, stood in the gray morning light and understood, each in his own way, that whatever the winter demanded of them between now and the thaw, they would meet it with only what was already inside the sheds, nothing more. Pruitt took stock of the stores that same gray morning, with a lamp in one hand and his ledger in the other, and by midday he had announced the ration before he announced anything else, half portions of rice and salt pork, doled out by his own hand at his own hour, because a man who controlled the food controlled a sealed camp better than any lock could. When Tam, cautious but direct, suggested to Pruitt that the herbalist's daughter might have something in her father's trunk worth trying once the salt meat and stale rice started working on men's gums the way it always did on a long ration, Pruitt only laughed, short and without much humor in it, and said the men would keep their strength better on prayer and patience than on a dead man's roots carried across an ocean for no reason anyone here could verify. He said it loudly enough for half the shed to hear, and most of the men, cold and frightened and eager for something solid to believe in, nodded along without much thought, because superstition was an easy thing to laugh at when you did not yet know what a slow winter without green food actually did to a body. That same first night of the seal, while Pruitt counted his sacks by lamplight and the rest of the camp settled into a silence too heavy to be called sleep, Callahan came back to where Mei Yin sat alone tending the last of the cook fire, her father's trunk within reach the way it always was now. He crouched across the fire from her, turning his hat slowly in his hands the way a man does when he has decided to ask something he suspects is overdue, and asked her, plainly, what her name actually was, not the number in Pruitt's ledger, not cook, female, Chinese, but the name her own father had given her before any of this. She told him, Mei Yin. He repeated it back carefully, getting the tone wrong the way every Englishman got it wrong, and did not laugh at his own mistake, only asked if he had said it close enough and tried again when she told him, gently, that he had not quite. Then, without ceremony, he took a heavy iron key from his coat and set it in her palm, the key to the boxcar where the company kept what medicine it allowed itself, and told her that whatever she had in that trunk, this camp was going to need all of it before spring. Mei Yin did not sleep that night either, not from fear this time, but from the particular, wide-awake clarity that comes when a decision finally settles. She opened the trunk fully for the first time since the dock at San Francisco, laid every packet out on the cot in the order her father had taught her, fever remedies first, then the ones for wasting and cold injury, then the small paper twists of powders meant only for emergencies too severe to name casually, and began, item by item, translating each one in her head from the words her father had used into the words this camp would need to hear if it was ever going to trust her enough to swallow any of it. She thought of the false bottom he had built into the trunk himself, the care he had taken packing roots that would survive a 40-day crossing, and understood, turning each packet over in the lamplight, that he had not simply left her an inheritance. He had left her a whole winter's argument, already assembled, waiting only for a camp desperate enough to finally listen to it. By the time the fire outside burned down to coals, she had a plan sorted into 4 piles, and a key from Callahan warm still in her coat pocket. The first remedy she offered the camp was the simplest, and the one most likely to matter over a long ration of salt meat and stale rice. A tea brewed from dried pine needles her father had gathered and cured for exactly this purpose, bitter and resinous, meant to hold off the bleeding gums and loosening teeth that came, slow and certain, from weeks without anything green. She brewed a full pot of it openly at the cook fire one evening and set it beside the regular tea without announcement, and most of the men passed it by with a glance and a joke about Chinese witchcraft, exactly as Pruitt had predicted they would. Only Tam, watching her with the particular attention he had paid since the wagon first brought her up the grade, accepted a cup without comment, drank it down in 3 swallows, and set the empty cup back on the plank table with a small, unreadable nod that was not quite trust yet, but was not dismissal either. She said nothing to press the point. Her father had taught her that medicine offered too eagerly made people suspicious of it, and that the best remedy in the world was worthless if no one could be persuaded to actually drink it, so she simply left the pot where it was, night after night, and waited. It was 3 nights later that she woke to the sound of someone moving carefully near the cook fire in the dark, and found, when she looked, one of the younger rail hands crouched over the cooling pot, ladling a cup for himself with the furtive care of a man who did not want to be seen believing in something the whole shed had agreed to mock. He startled when he saw her watching, cup half raised, and for a moment neither of them said anything, until she simply nodded toward the pot and told him, in her careful English, to drink it while it was still warm. That cold tea worked the body no differently than warm, but warm was kinder going down on a night this bitter. He drank it in silence, thanked her in a mumble too quiet to carry past the fire, and slipped back to his bunk before anyone else stirred. She did not tell Tam, or Callahan, or anyone at all, understanding instinctively that a man's first taste of trust needed privacy to survive its own embarrassment, and that the tea would do its slow work in his gums and blood, whether or not he ever admitted, in daylight, to having wanted it in the first place. Within the week, the cold and the cramped bunks had done what cold and cramped bunks always did, and a fever moved through two of the younger hands hard enough that Callahan came to her cookfire himself, his usual reserve gone thin with worry, and asked whether her father's trunk held anything at all for a fever that would not break. She brewed willow bark the way her father had shown her 100 times in Canton, steeping it long and strong, and sat with the sicker of the two men through the worst of the night, wringing cool cloths for his forehead between cups, watching his breathing the way her mother had once watched her own as a child. Callahan stayed too, carrying water and firewood without being asked, saying little, doing exactly what she told him to do without once questioning why a woman he had known 3 weeks now seemed to know more about keeping a man alive than the company's own absent doctor ever had. Near dawn, the fever broke, sweat-soaked and sudden, and the young hand opened his eyes and asked, weakly, for water in a voice that was unmistakably his own again. Callahan looked at her across the cot for a long moment and said nothing, but something in his face had already changed. Frostbite arrived the way it always did on a grade crew forced to keep working through weather no sensible outfit would tolerate. First as numbness the men shrugged off, then as fingers gone waxy white and hands that would not close properly around a shovel handle. Mei Yin treated the first cases with slow, careful warming, never the fire itself, which her father had always warned would cook flesh that had lost its feeling before the man even knew he was burning, and with small cones of moxa punk pressed near, not on, the numbest joints, lit and left to smolder down to a gentle heat that coaxed blood back into fingers without shocking them. The men who submitted to it, awkward and half embarrassed the first time, watched their own hands with something like disbelief as color crept back into skin that had gone the color of old snow, and word of the technique spread through the crew faster than the tea had, because a man's hands were his living, and a hand saved from the surgeon's blade was worth more to him than any argument about superstition Pruitt could offer. She kept careful count in her head of every case treated, the way her father had always kept count, and the list grew longer every week. When a second wave of fever broke out in the crowded main bunkhouse, spreading faster than the first because 40 men slept close enough to share breath as well as blankets, Mei Yin went to Callahan with a request rather than a remedy. The empty boxcar Pruitt used for overflow tools, cleared out and given over entirely to the sick, separated from the healthy by more than a few feet of shared plank wall. Callahan argued with Pruitt over it for the better part of an afternoon, the two men's voices carrying clear across the yard, Pruitt calling it a waste of a car the company would want accounted for, and Callahan answering, flatly, that he would rather account for an empty tool car than for dead men come spring. He won the argument, or perhaps simply outlasted it, and by evening the sick had been moved, bedding and all, into a boxcar with its own stove, and its own strict rule, enforced by Mei Yin herself, that no one crossed from the well side of camp to the sick side without washing hands first in water she kept boiling near the door. The fever, this time, did not spread past the dozen men already carrying it, a fact the camp noticed even before it fully understood why. She had noticed in her first weeks at the cookfire that half the camp drank meltwater straight from whatever pot happened to be nearest, unboiled, unstrained, taken on faith that snow itself was clean simply because it looked white and fell from a clean sky, and she began, quietly, insisting otherwise. Every pot of drinking water at her cookfire was boiled first and skimmed of the grit and pine debris that inevitably worked into meltwater collected near a construction camp, a habit her father had drilled into her since childhood, when a bad well had taken 2 of their neighbors in a single season and spared everyone who had simply boiled first. Pruitt called it wasted fuel at first, one more of her father's superstitions dressed up as caution, but even he stopped arguing once the camp's second bout of stomach sickness that winter turned out to hit hardest among the men who still drank straight from the barrel rather than her boiled kettles. She did not lecture anyone about it, she simply kept boiling, kept skimming, kept filling the same dented kettle over and over through the coldest weeks, and let the difference in who stayed well and who did not make the argument for her, the way her father had always said good medicine eventually would. By the 4th week of the seal, Pruitt's own ration count had begun to slip, whether from carelessness or from the strain of managing 40 frightened men on shrinking stores, and Mei Yin, watching him miscount a sack of rice twice in 1 week, quietly began keeping her own tally on the small wooden abacus her father had used for weighing out remedies by the correct dose. She used it first only to track what she herself dispensed from the boxcar, then, almost without deciding to began cross-checking Pruitt's ration figures against how many days the remaining stores could actually stretch if divided evenly, rather than by his increasingly erratic hand. When she found his count short by nearly a week's worth of rice against what his own ledger claimed remained, she did not accuse him outright, only brought the discrepancy to Callahan with her abacus figures laid out plainly, forcing a recount that proved her right down to the pound. Pruitt was furious, and said so loudly, but even he could not argue with beads on a wire counted twice and matching both times, and from that week on, the camp's ration was recalculated by her figures as often as his, a small, unspoken shift in whose numbers a starving camp trusted more. Word of what the boxcar held and what the woman running it could do moved through Camp 11 the way everything eventually moved through a sealed camp, slowly at first, then all at once. By the 5th week, men who had mocked the pine tea openly in the first days now came to the boxcar door in the gray hour before their shift, silent, hands cracked and split from cold and rope work, waiting their turn without being asked to wait, watching her mix salves and count doses with an attentiveness they had not shown her since the wagon first brought her up the grade. Nobody made a show of it, nobody announced a change of heart out loud, because pride in that camp ran as deep as fear did, and admitting a woman's roots had done what the company's absent doctor could not was not a sentence any of them found easy to say plainly. But the line at the boxcar door grew a little longer every morning, and the jokes about witchcraft grew quieter, and Mei Yin, treating each cracked palm in turn, understood that this particular silence, men queuing without complaint in the cold, was its own kind of apology, offered the only way this camp knew how to offer one. Not every man surrendered quietly. Kwok, the senior hand who had led the tunnel gang's Chinese crew for 2 winters before Mei Yin ever arrived, cornered her at the boxcar door one morning and said, plainly, in front of half a dozen listening men, that a girl was not a physician, that her father's trade had been selling powders to farmers' wives in Canton, not treating men trapped inside a mountain, and that the camp's faith in her was going to get someone killed. Mei Yin did not raise her voice to answer him. She asked him, instead, how many winters he had watched a man's gums bleed and his teeth loosen from salt rations with nothing done about it, and whether he could name a single case, in all his years on this grade, where doing nothing had saved a life that doing something might have lost. Kwok had no answer ready for that, and the men around them who had been ready to side with him a moment before went quiet in a way that told her the argument had turned. 3 days later, Kwok came to the boxcar himself, silent, offering his own split knuckles without a word of explanation, and she treated him exactly as carefully as she treated every other man who had doubted her first. Callahan had taken to stopping by the boxcar most evenings, ostensibly to check on the health of his crew but staying longer than the checking required, watching Mei Yin work with an attention he did not fully explain even to himself. He watched her measure doses by instinct and memory rather than by any written formulary, watched her adjust a treatment mid-course when a man's color told her something his complaints had not, watched her keep, in a small cloth-bound book she had started herself, a running record of every case in camp, symptom, remedy, outcome, the same careful accounting her father had once kept, and that she was building fresh, in a language and a country that had never once asked her to keep it. One evening, watching her set a splint on a broken finger with the same unhurried patience she gave every task, he told her, quietly, that he had buried men on this grade whom a doctor with half her care might have saved, and that he did not know how to thank a woman properly for making sure his crew would not join them. She told him, just as quietly, that thanks were not necessary, only that he keep sending men to her before their hands got any worse. He came the very next morning with 2 more. The worst case came in the 6th week, when a boy barely 17 named Bo, sent out with a crew to clear snow from the shed roofs, fell through a weakened section and lay half-buried and unconscious in the cold for the better part of an hour before anyone found him. He was carried in blue-lipped and barely breathing, his core gone dangerously cold, and half the camp gathered outside the boxcar in the falling snow, certain, from the look of him, that they were about to watch the winter claim its first death. Mei Yin worked over him for hours, warming him slowly by layers the way her father had taught her, never all at once, never with direct fire, only steady, patient heat and warm broth, spooned carefully past lips, too numb to swallow properly, while Callahan held the crowd back from the door, and Tam and Kwok both stood vigil without being asked. Near midnight, Bo's eyes opened, confused and frightened but unmistakably alive, and asked, in a cracked whisper, whether he had missed his shift. The relief that moved through the gathered men outside the boxcar door was not quiet this time. For the first time since the seal began, Camp 11 cheered for something, and the something was her. After Bo, something in the camp's daily rhythm changed in a way even Pruitt could not fail to notice. The jokes about witchcraft stopped entirely, replaced by a rougher, more sincere kind of camp humor, men teasing each other now about who had been slowest to trust her, about whose stubborn pride had cost him the worst frostbite before he finally gave in and let her treat him. Someone began calling her, half in jest and half not, the camp's own doctor, a title that stuck faster than anyone expected, and that Callahan used without irony within the week. Men who had once discussed her in English over her head as though she could not follow, now addressed her directly, haltingly at first and then with more ease, testing simple words and watching her correct them, gently, the way she corrected everything, without making a man feel foolish for trying. Tam told her one evening, over the cook fire, that the camp owed her a debt it did not yet know how to repay, and that debts in a place like this had a way of coming due eventually, whether the men who owed them planned for it or not. She did not know yet how right he was, or how soon. Pruitt, watching his own authority erode a little more each week as the camp's trust shifted visibly toward the boxcar, found his response in the one language he still controlled absolutely, the ledger. He summoned Mei Yin to the store's tent one morning and informed her, in the flat tone he used for company business, that every remedy she had dispensed from the boxcar, every packet of bark, every twist of moxa punk, every hour of fuel burned warming the sick, represented a cost the company had never authorized, and that the value of it would be deducted from her own contract debt going forward, since she alone had decided to distribute goods that were not, strictly speaking, hers to give away. It was, on its face, an accounting argument, delivered with Pruitt's usual bloodless precision, but Mei Yin understood immediately what it actually was, an attempt to punish her, quietly and through the one channel he still owned, for having become more essential to this camp's survival than he was. She did not argue with him directly, she only asked, evenly, whether he intended to post the new charges publicly, the way he posted every other ration change, so the men who had received the treatment could see exactly what it was about to cost her. Pruitt posted the charge that same afternoon, expecting perhaps that the men would shrug at an arithmetic dispute between a contractor and his cook, the way they shrugged at most of his decisions. Instead, by supper time, Tam had gathered nearly the whole crew at the store's tent door, Kwok beside him, Bo still pale but on his feet at the back of the group, and told Pruitt, plainly, on behalf of every man who had walked into that boxcar since the seal began, that if the company intended to charge her for the medicine that had kept this camp alive, it could charge the whole crew equally, since every one of them had used it, or it could charge no one at all. Callahan stood a little apart, arms crossed, saying nothing, letting the men speak for themselves in a way Pruitt clearly had not expected and could not easily dismiss as one troublesome cook's complaint. Pruitt looked out at 40 faces that had, 6 weeks earlier, barely known her name, and understood, even before Callahan said a single word, that he had badly misjudged how far the ground under his authority had already shifted. He withdrew the charge before dark, calling it a bookkeeping correction, though everyone in that yard knew exactly what it actually was. It was Tam, of all people, who finally asked the question Mei Yin had spent the whole winter not asking herself directly: what had actually happened to her father on that crossing, beyond the plain fact of a fever that had taken 2 other passengers besides. She told him what she remembered: the hold thick with sickness, the ship's own surgeon refusing to treat the steerage passengers at all, her father dosing strangers with what remedies he had left even as his own fever climbed, giving away, in his last clear days, medicine he might have used to save himself. She had never let herself finish that thought fully before, that her father had likely died faster, not slower, for the same instinct she was now living out in this camp, spending himself on other men's survival until there was nothing left over for his own. Tam said nothing for a long moment, then told her, quietly, that a man who died giving his medicine to strangers on a ship had raised a daughter who was now doing exactly the same thing on a mountain, and that perhaps that was not coincidence so much as inheritance. Mei Yin did not answer him. She only closed her hand, for a moment, around the trunk's worn iron latch. Callahan told her the rest of it himself, one of the last quiet evenings before the thaw finally began, sitting across the boxcar's small stove with a candor she suspected the winter itself had worn into him. His brother Michael had come west with him from the same county, worked this same grade, and died in a blast that went off early, before the crew had cleared the cut, because a company foreman under deadline pressure had rushed the timing rather than lose a day's progress. Callahan had pulled what was left of him out of the rubble himself and had never, in 3 winters since, fully forgiven either the company or himself for not arguing harder against the rushed schedule that morning. He said he had watched this camp's whole winter through that same fear, certain that this mountain would take something else from him before spring, and that the night he asked Mei Yin her name had been, if he was honest, less an act of kindness than an act of desperation, a man trying to make sure that whatever else the seal took, it would not take this camp's only real chance at surviving it. She told him that fear dressed as kindness was still kindness, and he did not argue the point. Small things had begun accumulating between them without either of them naming what they were. Callahan had taken, without comment, to bringing his own bowl to her cook fire rather than eating with the other foreman, and to holding it, she noticed one evening, with both hands wrapped around its warmth instead of one, the way she had once shown Bo to hold a cup of willow bark tea so the heat could work into cold stiffened fingers as well as into his throat. She had not taught him that gesture directly. He had simply watched, over 6 weeks of tending this camp's hurts, and absorbed it the way a man absorbs a habit from someone he is paying closer attention to than he says out loud. She found herself, in turn, saving him the better portion of whatever the ration allowed without deciding to, the way her mother had once served her father before either of them called it courtship. Neither of them spoke of it plainly, because the camp was still watching, still deciding how much of this shift in her standing it was prepared to accept, and both of them understood, without discussing it, that whatever this was between them would need to survive daylight and other people's opinions before it could survive being spoken aloud. Her English had changed since the wagon first brought her up the grade, and she noticed it herself now in small, surprising moments, arguing a ration figure with Pruitt's clerk, without rehearsing the sentence first in her head, explaining a dosage to a new man, in a full, confident run of words, instead of the careful, halting phrases she had leaned on in the first weeks. Callahan remarked on it one evening, half teasing, saying she used to cross a sentence like a woman stepping on stones set too far apart, testing each one before trusting her weight to it, and now she crossed it like she had built the bridge herself. She told him that was because, for the first time since Canton, people in this camp were actually listening for what she meant, instead of waiting for her to finish so they could speak over her, and that being heard, finally, made a person braver with her words than any lesson book ever could. Bo, listening nearby, added that she had also started correcting the men's manners now as easily as their dosages, which was, he said, its own kind of proof that she had stopped being a guest in this camp and started being someone the camp answered to. With the worst of the sickness behind them and the boxcar running now almost as its own small infirmary, Callahan made a decision he did not ask Pruitt's permission for. He announced to the assembled camp, plainly, that from that week forward any man reporting for shift with an injury or illness was to see Mei Yin first, before Pruitt's ledger, before anything else, because a healthy crew mattered more to this camp's survival than a perfectly balanced ration count ever would. Pruitt objected, loudly, that a foreman had no authority to reorganize company priorities without the labor contractor's sign-off, and Callahan answered, in front of the whole gathered crew, that he would answer to the company for it happily, in writing, the day the company sent someone up here to ask, and that until then he would answer to the 40 men whose lives depended on the decision instead. It was, Mei Yin understood watching him say it, the closest thing to a public declaration Callahan was capable of making in this camp, not of affection exactly, but of standing, a foreman staking his own authority on her judgment in front of every man who mattered, and she felt the weight of it settle into her chest like something she had not known, until that moment she had been waiting for. Even with every remedy she could offer, the 7th week tested the camp harder than any before it. The rice stores down to what Pruitt admitted, grudgingly, was barely 10 days' worth even at half ration, and the salt pork gone entirely, replaced by whatever thin broth could be stretched from bones already boiled twice over. Men grew gaunt and short-tempered, tempers that had held through 6 weeks of genuine danger fraying now over smaller things, a spilled bowl, a slow shift, the particular exhaustion of hope deferred 1 week too many. Mei Yin rationed her remedies as carefully as Pruitt rationed the rice, stretching the last of the willow bark and pine needle stores across a camp that needed all of it and had none of it to spare, calculating on her abacus, night after night, exactly how many more days her father's trunk could stand between 40 men and the worst the winter still had left to give. She did not tell anyone, not even Callahan, how thin her own margin had grown, because a camp holding on by its fingernails did not need to know precisely how close those fingernails were to giving out, only that someone was still counting, carefully, on their behalf. The first sign came not as warmth but as sound, a dripping from the shed eaves that no one had heard in 7 weeks, small and steady and, to ears that had learned to listen for the mountain's every mood, unmistakable. Within 2 days the drip had become a trickle running along the base of the avalanche wall sealing the tunnel mouth, and within a week the packed snow itself had begun to darken and slump at its edges, the slow, grinding work of a Sierra spring finally beginning to undo what a January night had done in seconds. Callahan walked out to the slide face every morning now, measuring its retreat against a stick driven into the snow the day before, reporting the inches back to a camp that counted them the way a starving man counts anything that might mean rescue was closer than it had been the day before. Mei Yin kept treating what needed treating, and kept her own count running alongside his, and for the first time since the seal began, allowed herself to imagine, in careful, unspoken pieces, what it might actually mean to walk out from under this mountain's shadow with every single man who had walked in still breathing beside her. On a gray morning in the 2nd week of the thaw, the camp heard, for the first time in almost 8 weeks, a sound from the far side of the avalanche wall that was unmistakably human, the ring of pickaxes and shovels striking packed snow and frozen debris, faint and irregular but undeniably real, a rescue crew working its way toward them from the railhead side at last. The men dropped whatever they were doing and gathered at the slide face, shouting until their voices went hoarse, and for a long, disorienting hour the digging sounds seemed to come no closer at all, the mountain apparently unwilling to give up its hold without one final test of patience. Mei Yin stood among the men listening as hard as any of them, her father's trunk, considerably lighter now than it had been 8 weeks before, sitting back in the boxcar where it had done its work, and thought that whatever the rescue crew found when they finally broke through, it would not be the camp of frightened, doubtful men who had watched her unpack that trunk in January. It would be a camp that had learned, the hard way, exactly what it owed her, and she wondered, not for the first time, whether the company on the other side of that wall would ever think to ask. The shovels broke through on a bright, hard morning in early April, a fist-sized hole of daylight appearing suddenly in the packed snow wall that the whole camp had stared at for 8 weeks, followed by voices, startled and relieved in equal measure, from men on the other side who had clearly not expected to find every single member of Camp 11 alive and on their feet to greet them. The hole widened through the afternoon as both sides dug from opposite directions, and by evening a man could pass through it standing nearly upright, the first true opening between Camp 11 and the rest of the world since the January night the mountain had sealed it shut. Bo was first through from the campside, insisting despite Kwok's objections, and the rescue crew's foreman, staring at the boy's healthy color and steady step, asked, more than once, how a camp cut off for 8 weeks with no doctor had not lost a single man to fever, frostbite, or scurvy, a question nobody in Camp 11 answered directly at first, all of them turning, instead, without quite planning it, to look at the small figure standing near the boxcar door with an abacus still in her coat pocket. Word of Camp 11's survival reached the company offices in Sacramento within days, carried down the newly cleared grade by riders eager to report good news after a winter that had cost the Central Pacific dearly elsewhere along the line, and the account that circulated first, shaped by Pruitt's own report, credited the camp's survival chiefly to prudent rationing and sound company planning, with the herbalist's daughter mentioned, if at all, as a useful camp cook who had assisted where instructed. Pruitt was not, Mei Yin understood without much surprise, a cruel man so much as a careful one, and careful men protected their own ledgers first, even when the ledger in question had very little honest claim to the outcome it was now taking credit for. Callahan read Pruitt's report when it circulated back up the grade and said almost nothing about it aloud, but Mei Yin recognized, in the particular stillness that came over him afterward, the same look he had worn the week he had learned a company foreman's rushed schedule had killed his brother and then written the incident up as an unavoidable accident. He did not argue with Pruitt in front of the men this time. He simply began, quietly, gathering names for a different kind of account entirely. When the company paymaster, a precise, unhurried man named Whitfield, finally rode up the cleared grade 3 weeks later to settle wages and close out the winter's contracts, Callahan was waiting for him with nearly the entire surviving crew of Camp 11 gathered in the yard, not as a mob, but as witnesses, arranged the way Callahan arranged a work crew for an inspection, orderly and deliberate. One by one, without needing to be prompted twice, the men told Whitfield exactly what had kept them alive through 8 sealed weeks, Tam describing the pine needle tea that had spared his gums, Bo describing, in halting but improving English of his own, the night he had nearly died on a shed roof, and the woman who had warmed him back from it hour by hour, Kwok admitting, plainly, that he had doubted her longest of any man in camp and owed her the most for it. Whitfield listened to all of it without interrupting, his pen moving steadily across a fresh page of his own ledger, and when the last man finished speaking, he looked toward Mei Yin, standing quietly near the boxcar with her father's trunk visible through the open door behind her, and asked her, for the first time since she had arrived at this camp, what her name actually was. Whitfield's finding, when he wrote it into the company's own record 2 days later, settled more than anyone in Camp 11 had expected any company document ever could. The contract debt inherited from her father, still carrying a balance the labor office had never bothered to recalculate against 8 weeks of unpaid, unrecorded medical labor, was declared satisfied in full and then some, and her wages for the winter, previously counted at the same reduced rate paid to any camp cook, were recalculated and paid out complete, backdated to the night the Avalanche sealed the camp. At the top of the settled ledger page, above every other name on the crew list, Whitfield wrote her name in his own steady hand, Mei Yin, and then, after a pause, Callahan told her later he had not expected from a man he had taken for entirely bloodless, asked her to write her name beside it in her own characters as well, so the record would carry both. She took the pen and wrote the 2 characters her father had taught her before he had taught her anything else, watching the ink settle into a company ledger that had once reduced her to 6 digits and 3 flat words, and understood that this was not vindication exactly. It was simply, finally, accuracy. The men built her the cabin themselves over the following weeks, using timber salvaged from the shed sections damaged in the slide, framing it deliberately close to the boxcar that had served all winter as her infirmary, so that whatever came next up this grade, the camp would never again be more than a short walk from what her father's trunk could offer it. Tam carved a small sign for the door, her name in both English letters and her own characters, and Bo, whose hands had fully healed by then, helped hang the shelves inside himself, insisting on doing at least that much personally. Callahan came by the evening it was finished, after the crowd had thinned, and accepted the bowl of tea she offered him the way he had learned to, both hands wrapped around its warmth instead of one, holding her gaze a beat longer than the gesture strictly required. Neither of them spoke yet of what came next between them, of whether a company town built on gold and rail iron had any place for what this winter had grown between a foreman and a contracted cook, or of what still waited unanswered about a brother lost to a rushed blast and a father lost to a fevered crossing. Some debts, she thought, watching him drink, took longer than a winter to settle, but this one, at least, had finally begun.